Over a 40-year span, Texas experienced at least 32 mass shootings beginning in 1980. They included a church shooting in Dangerfield that year, which served as the backbone of KXAN's 2019 project, A History of Mass Violence. At that time, our investigative team's analysis showed more than 250 people had been wounded in such events statewide during that period, and at least 208 were killed. We took a critical look at that violent history as state leaders weighed options to prevent future tragedies. This week on a From the Vault edition of our weekly Inside the Investigation program, we revisit our original project and update you on the topics still playing out across Texas today. Hello and welcome to a From the Vault edition of our weekly Inside the Investigation program. I'm KXAN Director of Investigations and Innovation, Josh Hinkle, joined by my colleague, investigative reporter Arzo Dost. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So with this From the Vault initiative, what we're doing is taking looks at some of our past docuseries projects to really update them and kind of show you where we are today in Texas with where those important topics stand. Today we're talking about a very timely one unfortunately that has continued to play out over several years, and we're talking about the history of mass violence. This is about mass shootings in Texas, which we've unfortunately had way too many of over the years. For this project specifically, we weren't just looking at what's happening now or even when we launched this project back in 2019, but we wanted to look even further back in history. So at that time, we took a 40-year look starting back in 1980, when there were two mass shootings that happened in Texas, two of the first documented in Texas. And so our team traveled to different corners of the state, first in Dangerfield, where in 1980 there was a church shooting. A former math teacher who was upset with some members of the congregation came in on a Sunday morning during service while they were singing. This was actually being recorded and broadcast live over a radio station at the time. So we have the actual shooting audio of what happened at that point. He ended up killing 5 people, injuring several others. One of those who died was a 7-year-old girl named Gina Lynham. We were able to track down her family at that point, her mom and sister, and talk to them. And I think the thing that really struck me was with how raw their emotion still was. After 40 years, they were still thinking about this every single day, still very angry, still not understanding why the state hasn't been able to really stop all of this mass violence, because as we saw in our docuseries, it continued. There were several other mass shootings that have happened since then, and even since our project, we've seen some as well. Another mass shooting that we covered in 1980, as I said, is on the other side of the state, which was El Paso. In February of that year, there was a mass shooting at a country western dive bar called the Starburst Lounge, which doesn't even exist anymore. A man came in there and shot and killed 5 people. We also, spoke to some of the victims' family members, and kind of a similar story there. It's still very raw and still something that they think about on a daily basis. We actually also spoke to a man who was one of the survivors there. He was shot in the face, actually, and he lived. And today, his older son at the time, in 2019, was a first responder who unfortunately had to respond to another well-known mass shooting. It was at the El Paso Walmart that year, and that really kind of sparked our project and why we wanted to do that, because that had just happened recently when we launched A History of Mass Violence. I know you've been following up with that shooting at the El Paso Walmart from 2019. Where does that stand now?
Well, it's been nearly 6 years when the gunman from the Dallas area drove all the way to El Paso and admitted to targeting the Hispanic community and going on a shooting spree. I mean, we're talking about more than 24 people hurt, 23 deaths in this shooting. And really, as I mentioned, nearly 6 years later, last April was a really significant time for this case, because that's when the sentencing and that happened, kind of wrapping things up for the families of the victims. And during that sentencing, the gunman who had admitted to the shooting, he pled guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The death penalty was taken off, and there was a lot of discussion about that. But one of the most significant things that happened during this hearing that still, it gives me chills just, going back to review it. But something that's still talked about today is the fact that a couple of the families asked the judge to hug the gunman. They were so ready to put this devastation, this heartbreak behind them and really move towards healing and forgiveness. During one of those hugs, there were some words exchanged between one family member and the gunman. We never knew, the family never said what they talked about, but the fact that that moment happened was so instrumental. And you know, as a community, El Paso is for sure stronger than it's ever been, but the fact that these shootings continue to happen and these families continue to voice concerns has been significant as we've moved forward with legislation.
Yeah, it's been a very nuanced topic, and emotions kind of have a big range from anger to forgiveness, like you said. And what happened in El Paso and another mass shooting right around that same time that year in Odessa, they really prompted a call for action from the legislature. People wanted something done. They were tired of these things happening over and over. And here in Texas, because of course this is an issue that's been playing out across the U.S. What we saw at that point was that it was after the legislative session had ended already. So lawmakers weren't here in session at the Capitol at the time, but Governor Abbott did want to respond to this. He didn't end up calling a special session, which is what many people thought he might do to specifically focus on this issue, which he can do outside of a regular session, call a month-long special session. What he ended up doing was creating a commission that had roundtables, and so it was a lot of experts, witnesses, that kind of thing, where they were gathering information so they could help craft a compact, which was kind of like a set of recommendations, and he ended up creating some executive orders out of that. A lot of them kind of focused on things that the public was looking at, and you know, for instance, one of those was like making sure that if you see something that you think that someone might be capable of committing violence, that you have an easy way to report that and you understand that you can do that. So a lot of it was kind of around public reporting. That was one of the things that we saw at that point that really prompted us to continue this project beyond a history of mass violence. And we launched a solutions journalism project called Stop Mass Shootings. And you were involved in that one. How did that play out for us?
Well, you know, the fact that we continue to have these shootings, the conversations we're continuing to have and the questions we're continuing to be asked, how can this continue to keep happening, right? And so as part of that, we wanted, you know, as you mentioned, Governor Abbott was really key on alertness and also training. And so as part of that, we were able to really focus on a group that is focused on training for law enforcement. Alert, out of Texas State, known for advanced law enforcement rapid response training. What this group does, travels the country really to go train law enforcement. Today, more than 300,000 first responders have had this training, but it doesn't really stop there because the focus needs to be also on civilian communities, right? And given what we've seen with school shootings, there's now a big focus. And Alert, just speaking with them recently, tells me they are busier than ever because the demand has grown so much for not only for them to provide training for schools, hospitals, churches, but also the different departments that are starting to see some of these things play out in their own communities, whether big or small. So the focus is not only what do you do when a shooting happens like this, what do you do in that moment? But what do you do in the seconds after until first responders arrive? There are things like CPR, ways to prevent blood loss that you can do immediately to save lives. So this is really not just for first responders, but civilians, which is something that has been a key focus in the last several years.
And when we produced these stories for the Stop Mass Shootings project, we ended up sending those links to lawmakers who were involved in this conversation because we wanted them to be aware of some of the solutions we were exploring as they were considering what policies and legislation they could craft in a future session. So what ended up happening at that point was that the House and Senate both formed special committees to examine mass violence, much like what the Governor's Commission had done. And their intent was to hold hearings around the state. They went to El Paso, they went to Odessa, the places where the mass shootings had happened, talked to the people that had been impacted directly to kind of find out what pieces of the conversation they had missed, or that they wanted to make sure that they understood specifically before they started creating these bills for potential laws in the future. Unfortunately, what happened right around that time when we were going into the next legislative session were two major things in Texas and the United States as well. The coronavirus pandemic happened, and then we also had a major winter storm that knocked out the state's power grid. So, of course, with the COVID-19, there was no travel really, and so that kind of shut down a little bit of the conversations. And then when the state's power grid failed, of course, that kind of took over the agenda at the Capitol during that legislative session. So some of the legislation that they did want to propose did end up passing. Namely, there was one that required active shooter alerts to come out. If there was an active shooter, you would get an alert within 50 miles of that active shooting. But unfortunately, a lot of the things that they had intended to propose ended up not passing. That kind of brings us to what happened in 2022, though, because this is a problem, as I mentioned, that wasn't going away. We had Uvalde that happened. There was a shooter that came into the elementary school in Uvalde and killed 19 children and 2 teachers. One classroom, 19 children. And there was a lot of anger about that, a lot of things still playing out. But how is that one really impacting what we're doing in your mind?
Well, it takes you back to what you mentioned, going back to 1980 and talking to the families that were so gracious to relive those horrific moments with us. What they wanted, what they asked for is still playing out today. So it's hard not to ask, well, why haven't we done anything? Why have we really not focused on this? As you mentioned, as part of the Catalyst Project, we did a timeline where we heavily researched, looking at archives, newspapers, talking to victims, families involved. We did a timeline of 32 events where the focus was on incidents that involved more than 3 victims, not the shooter, and what happened in those situations, not only to the victims, survivors, but also law-wise. And we've covered everything from the shootings in Luby's, Killeen, where the Fort Hood was impacted, to Dallas, where police officers were targeted. Near us, you mentioned Uvalde, but also Sutherland Springs. I was one of the first reporters on scene to cover that shooting, and I will never forget the cries of family members as they were waiting to hear back if their loved one was inside that church during the Sutherland Springs shooting. So, we've come a long way as far as discussions go, and we even launched a roundtable discussion that was more than an hour long at UT that focused on gun policy and mental health and key questions that were being asked. And it's fair to say that today the frustrations are still there. What is being done? Why have we not really focused on gun policy like we should?
With Uvalde specifically, as you kind of mentioned that timeline, it keeps growing. And I think what struck so many lawmakers at that point was this was children, and it was very personal to them. The mayor of Uvalde actually ran for office after that point, for state office, and was elected as a state representative. He filed that next session the Uvalde Strong Act. And what the Uvalde Strong Act did was it focused on training and emergency response inside of schools. It requires districts to strengthen their emergency operation plans, and then it requires more training for school staff, police, and emergency responders. Districts also have to regularly review and update their safety plans and make sure that they align with state standards. But that wasn't the only school security and safety legislation that we saw pass out of that session. Another new law that passed since Uvalde requires every school to have an armed presence during school hours. School security personnel must also have active shooter training every 2 years, and basic training for school staff and security personnel on alerts. And another new law actually expanded access to mental health resources, as this has been a big part of the conversation as well. I mentioned the Uvalde Strong Act and what happened there. It dealt a lot with the response from law enforcement, which has been criticized very heavily in the years since the Uvalde shooting. There were around 400 officers that showed up to respond to that scene, but they were there from the moment they got there for 77 minutes before entering the classroom. where the children were already dead. And a lot of the criticism has said if they had gone in sooner, maybe they would have been able to save lives. The shooter was shot and killed at that point, but it has sparked a big conversation that is still playing out today. In fact, this week, very timely, one of the 2 officers who has been charged in some of what happened that day has gone on trial. So of course we will continue updating you on that at KXAN.com and updating you as the other trial plays out as well. But anything else you want to add from your takeaways on this topic that no doubt we're going to continue covering as we work into the next legislative session in 2027 and kind of see how the rest of what's happening plays out?
Absolutely. You know, one of the key things when you were talking about Uvalde is the alert system we mentioned. It is now more significant than ever for the resource officers to have the training, and many districts across the state are making sure, enforcing the fact to have alert come on their campus and do training for their resource officers. So that's been huge. Having kids in school myself, I get the alerts all the time, so that's great news. The one drawback is you're getting them so many times now that sometimes you wonder how serious it is. But nonetheless, across the board, parents feel like this is the right direction we should go. But coming up, you know, when we think about this next session, this needs to be a focus, right? You've got to think about the kids, not only in Uvalde, but let's go back to the families in the 1980s who were asking for the same measures that never saw it come to fruition.
No doubt we will hear much more about that right here at the Capitol. Thanks a lot, Arzo.
Thank you.
You can watch all new episodes of Inside the Investigation on the KXAN Plus Smart TV app every Friday. You can also listen to an audio version on KXAN's Investigative podcast with new episodes every Saturday morning wherever you get podcasts.